Welcome to our first weekly session. My name is Anush Newman, and I'm located in Calgary, Alberta. And I'd like to welcome you all today to our first weekly chat session. I will be the person who will continue to facilitate these weekly chats. So here was the first question we had today. How should sponsors approach the pre-screening? And thank you for all the people who have joined us with their feedback and their suggestions. Thank you very much. So let's move along with our PowerPoint presentation today. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, this is the review of the first module that you had the opportunity to read in your course. So right now we're going to review the Canadian Refugee Resettlement Program. We'll quickly walk through the 4 Canadian Refugee Sponsorship Resettlement Program. I'd like you to note that there are 4 key elements that determines the nature of the sponsorship program. So we have private sponsorship of refugees that provides the opportunity for Canadian citizens or PR to sponsor refugee. And the financial support comes from the community who's sponsoring. The settlement supports, i.e. the supports that the family and the individual needs after they arrive to Canada, is also taken up by the sponsoring group. And of course, they are referred to IRCC by the community, meaning that the refugees are known to the sponsors. So this is in general the private sponsorship of refugee, and we call that PSR for short. The second component of refugee program is what we call Blended Visa Office Referral, BVOR. And in terms of financial support that's required, as you know, it is covered partly by the government and partly by the sponsoring community. However, the settlement supports are provided by the sponsoring community or the sponsoring group. They refer to IRCC by UNHCR, meaning these refugees have been screened and vetted by the United Nations, and their names passed over to the Canadian officials, and the Canadian officials select these individuals or the families to be identified as a blended visa office referral. And the Canadian government picks up those names, and through our STP program, they're posted on our website. And the sponsoring groups here in Canada can select a family or individual that they want to sponsor. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, the financial responsibilities is shared with the government, i.e. 50-50. And also, most of the time, the refugees are not known to the sponsors because it is not requested by a local sponsor and have identified a refugee they want to sponsor. They just selected a name from a list. The third category is called Joint Assistance Sponsorship, and this is processed through the Canadian government again, and the financial support is covered by the Canadian government 100%, and it tends to last a little bit longer. And the settlement responsibilities is shared with the government and the community that are going to provide support to them when they arrive to Canada. And of course, they are referred to IRCC by United Nations. And again, the refugees are not known to the sponsors. And just to give you an example of this jazz, they are individuals or families that have a high need and challenging issues and high risk and multiple issues and challenges as well. Groups such as the Yazidis from northern Iraq, who our Canadian government brought to Canada, about 1,200 Yazidis from northern Iraq to be resettled here in Canada. And of course, we have the fourth category, the government-assisted refugees or GAR. The financial responsibilities for this group is covered by the Canadian government. The settlement supports provided to these individuals and the families are also covered by government via the immigrant serving agencies who have a contract to provide what we call resettlement services. And there are several of these agencies that have the contract that provide settlement supports to the families or individuals arriving in that community, and they do the follow-up with them. Most of the time, these cases are assigned to settlement workers that will provide settlement supports to these families. They are referred to IRCC by United Nations, and most of them have known, no, I shouldn't say that. They are not known by the sponsors. Well, most of the time they don't have families or know. Sometimes they might know some people in Canada themselves, but that's not the major point. The major point is that refugees are not known to the sponsors because there's no sponsor to the Canadian government who sponsored them. And as you know, the private sponsorship and the GAR, the financial supports are provided for 12 months from the time of arrival. Except for JAS, sometimes that may extend to a year, an extra year or extra 2 years, depending on the challenging situation that the family is facing. So let's look at who can sponsor under the PSR group. PSR stands for Private Sponsorship of Refugees. The sponsorship agreement holders, or the SAS for short, they are incorporated organizations, nonprofit organizations, business or corporations. They enter into contractual agreement with IRCC to sponsor refugees. And they may work with their constituent groups that are coming together and going to SR requesting sponsorship, and they will carry most of the settlement supports. Community sponsors, and I call this the mystery stream because not too many people know about this, and most people confuse community sponsors with the sponsorship agreement holders because of the confusion between community and the churches or community associations who do the sponsorship. So under this category, any organization, association, or corporation, a business, i.e. a store owner, an engineer who has an engineering company, or a jeweler or goldsmith, anybody who has a business can do a sponsorship as well as nonprofit organizations, churches, community associations, groups, and things like that. They have to be located in the community where the refugees are expected to settle. Very, very important to make sure that the sponsoring group are also situated in the same community. Of course, groups of 5, a lot of people know about this. This is where 5 or more Canadian citizens, registered Indians, or permanent residents come together and form a group. Of course, they must be age 18 and over and live in the same community where the sponsored refugees will be settled in the future. And collectively, 5 members of the group will arrange for the sponsorship. So they all sign on the document and they are all responsible for the financial and the settlement supports. Okay, so let's look at the key players, partners, and stakeholders in this program. Of course, the top one would be the Immigration, Refugee, and Citizenship Canada, and we call IRCC for sure because they have instituted this program to facilitate the sponsorship of refugees. We have another partner, it's called Resettlement Operations Center. They are part of IRCC, but it is the specific office that deals with the refugee application process. They are situated in Ottawa, and we call them ROCO for short. And the third partner is the Visa Office Abroad. The reason they are in there because, as you know, the sponsorship has 2 components to it: approval in Canada and the interview overseas by our visa officers. As well, the Refugee Sponsorship Training Program, RSTP, yours truly, Lydia and myself, we are part of the RSTP program, and we have the opportunity to share this information with you about the private sponsorship of refugees. Additionally, the SAW Association and Navigation Unit, the SAW, as I mentioned earlier, are the sponsorship agreement holders who are also involved in the refugee sponsorship. And Navigation Unit is the information body that provides information and directives. Canadian Council Refugees, CCR, kind of an advocacy group to encourage the government in terms of supporting the program and sponsoring more refugees if possible. Of course, UNHCR, that has the global responsibilities of managing refugees around the world. And the partner we call International Office for Migration is the one who assists our government in terms of final arrangements for medical and security check for refugees who have been approved to be sponsored, and provide all the travel documentations and arrangements for their last portion of their sponsorship journey to Canada. And IOM that also assists with the people who are traveling during their different stations if there was a need for that kind of support. So the application process, as we mentioned earlier, the first step would be the pre-screening. Pre-screening, arranging, making sure that the sponsor is eligible and the refugees are eligible to be sponsored. So in terms of the sponsorship, people, as I said, come together, whether they're coming through a SA or community sponsor or groups of 5, they form a group. And with that, they complete the application, meaning fill the application. As you know, there are some rules and guidelines for filling the application. It's important that sponsors follow up with these guidelines, because if they don't fill the forms according to the guidelines, the application might be returned. I.e., one of the major issues is that applications must be typed, not handwritten anymore. I know in the past the government had accepted handwritten application, but no more. And of course, submitting the application to ROCO office in Ottawa. Remember, I said there are several players in this stream, and ROCO is where the application for sponsorship goes. It's very, very important to make sure that you send the application to the right place. Sometimes applications go in the wrong place. For example, I have been contacted by a person. They submitted an application to sponsor refugees, but they've gone to a government immigration portal sponsorship of family class, and they submitted through there, not realizing that they're submitting it at the wrong place. And it took a couple of years for the government to respond back to say, you have submitted the application in the wrong place. You have to submit it to ROCO, not to family sponsorship portal. So it's important to be aware where you need to submit the application. So this is the kind of the process here. And in order for the application to be successful, let's look at some of the pre-screening elements of the application. So we're going to talk about eligibility. We'll make sure that the refugees are outside of their home country, that they have the documented refugee status determination. And this is important, especially for the groups of 5 and community sponsorship. And people who are sponsoring via the SAS, sponsorship agreement holders, don't need this final assessment issued by United Nations. However, even for sponsorship agreement holders, they still need some form of documents to prove that they are legitimate refugees, i.e. registered with the UN or have some kind of certification or an asylum seeking status in their third country. And that will be okay with the SAS, but for groups of 5 and community sponsorship, they need that last assessment done. And this document might take a couple of years to take place, so it has been difficult for some people to secure refugee status determination to be sponsored via groups of 5 and in community sponsorship. We'll make sure that they are not able to voluntarily return to their home country, in other words. And of course, their opportunity for local integration is not possible. And not able to be resettled, of course, in third country. In terms of admissibility criteria for sponsored refugees, they must go through a medical exam and address any medical issues that are currently happening and resolve that before they come to Canada. Our Canadian government will do a criminal check to make sure that individuals we're bringing to Canada are not a risk to our community. So security check is done as well. That's for the protection of Canadians. In terms of the refugee classes, how do we determine what is a refugee? We go by a couple of classifications. And one classification is the Convention Refugee Abroad class. This is when a well-funded fear of persecution based on race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, sexual orientation, gender, or any political opinions. And we've seen this happening, of course, via different countries who have been experiencing some crisis, and small groups of ethnic groups, religious groups have been persecuted based on their ethnicity and their religion or their nationality. Based on the 1951 Refugee Convention definition. And the second classification is country of asylum class, seriously and personally affected by civil war or armed conflict, or suffered massive violations of human rights. Let's say it was applicable to people who were living in Syria and they had to escape, people in Afghanistan who escaped because there was a war or an armed conflict and a massive violation to their rights. So these are the two classifications that our government follows, the Convention Refugee Abroad class and country of asylum. Definition that looks at a large country circumstances as well. So the UN also identifies what countries are in most critical condition in terms of identifying them, the people there who are seeking asylum in other country are eligible for that status. So they must not have a durable solution, meaning durable solution would be something like voluntary repatriation. That meaning that the refugees who escaped their home country are able to go back to their home country because things were stabilized and it's calm. So that's a durable solution. Another durable solution would be for the refugees if they're able to integrate in the new region that they have escaped to and were able to have the ability to work, earn a living, have their children attend school, and have a protection of that government. So these two are considered durable solutions. And the third component of this is resettlement, because if they're not able to return to their home country or integrate in the country that they sought asylum in, and the third durable solution would be being resettled into another country. So this is very, very important to remember when application is done, and one of the elements to be considered when an application is submitted, i.e. screening the application, because sometimes some countries are providing local integration and application may be rejected because of that. And there is a case where we know a family in Philippines that application was approved in Ottawa, but the visa officer decided to reject the application because they felt that that family has a durable solution in Philippines, meaning they're protected, their children can go to school, and they can work and earn living. So that's why it's important to be aware of the country conditions and situation and the possibility of local integration, because that may hinder the processing of the application. Who can be included on the same application? So let's look at the composition of the refugee or the refugee family. In terms of who is eligible to come, based on the eligibility and admissibility, and usually we call the person who has the strongest case that meets both criteria is principal applicant, the person who has strong case and that has been determined that he or she meets the eligibility criteria. So we call that person principal applicant. Sometimes it's the husband, sometimes it's the wife, sometimes a single person, sometimes a single parent with their children. So the principal applicant who has the eligibility and the admissibility option. Along with the principal applicant is his or her spouse, common law, partner, and this partner or the spouse need not to meet the eligibility criteria, but needs to meet the admissibility criteria. Along with the family are the dependents who are children under the age of 22 and not married. They do not need to meet the eligibility criteria, meaning they do not need to have the refugee status determination or the asylum seeking or any kind of documentations, because they are part of the family unit and where the principal applicant is holding the refugee status. Let's look at the IRCC process. And the process starts at the ROCO office. So the first portion of processing of the application is ensuring that the sponsors are able to meet the requirements of the sponsorship. Once that is approved and the application moves to the second stage, where it will be sent overseas to the closest consulate or embassy for the second portion of the sponsorship process and get the interview done by our visa officers. So there are two components: processing and approval in Ottawa, processing and approval overseas by our visa officers. So in Canada, the processing, so the application is submitted to ROCO office. As I mentioned earlier, the ROCO officer will evaluate the sponsoring group, make sure that they meet all the conditions and requirements and that they've done a screening themselves of these sponsors. They see their capabilities and their financial abilities, their settlement abilities. And if they approve that one, they will send the application to overseas. In terms of overseas processing, of course, as I mentioned earlier, there's an interview and screening takes place by our visa officer. And if that all is well, then they move to the next stage, which is medical and criminal security. However, we've seen sometimes, I've come up to some cases where the PA and the family have been forwarded information to go through the medical and criminal security check before they get to be interviewed. So sometimes they are called to the interview and then they referred for a medical examination and they do criminal check. And sometimes they do that second part before the interview. So it depends on the situation, each visa office. And if the principal applicant and his or her family have been approved by our visa officer that they are eligible to come to Canada and meet all the conditions, then IOM kicks in and provides the loans and visas and the travel documents. And the reason travel documents are issued because sometimes the refugees, when they escaped to another country, have not escaped via, let's say, using their passport and have their travel documents with them. So they have no form of travel documentation. Our Canadian government will issue one-time travel document for them to leave the country and come to Canada, even though they may not have a passport, or if they had a passport, their passport has expired. So they need to have that travel document. It's very, very important. And of course, their arrival to Canada hopefully doesn't take too long for that. Thank you for joining me today. And thank you, Lydia, for being there and monitoring the chats for me. And I look forward to connecting with you next week to continue the conversation for module number 2.